Good time, everybody. Hello, my name is Mustafa bin Nifard. Thank you very much for joining us for the last event in the fall 2021 series in the Ali Reza Ahmadian Lectures in Iranian and Persian Age Studies, conducted and held by the Asian Studies Department at the University of British Columbia. Tonight, we're hosting three dear guests, two presenters and a discussant, as you can see in the poster. Before I go ahead introducing them, I would like to read the land acknowledgement. And we acknowledge that although we are gathering virtually here in this Zoom space, UBC Vancouver is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As mentioned before, we have three presenters. I'll briefly mention the names at this point, and then some preliminary points as usual, and I'll introduce the guests in detail. So our presenters will be Dr. Mehdi Ganjavi, Robarts, affiliated with Robarts Library at the University of Toronto, and Mr. Meisam Alipour, MA in Art Studies from Tehran University of Art. They will be joined later after their presentation by Dr. Pegah Shahbaz as a discussant tonight. Dr. Shahbaz is a short postdoctoral fellow at the Center for South Asian Studies, Asian Institute, Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. Again, very brief introductions at this point. Before going into more details about our guests, I would like to give a big thank you to my own team, without whom I can really do just little. I would like to thank Kani on our closed captioning volunteer, Nazgul Tawakkulizadeh, who unfortunately couldn't join us tonight, but we do have closed captioning, especially because Mr. Alipour will be presenting his speech in Persian. At the same time, there will be the closed captioning of the translation of his speech in English, provided at the bottom. So if you or anyone near you needs to access the closed captioning, please click live transcript at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar and click on show subtitles so you can see. For Dr. Ganjavi's presentation as well, we will have accurate script shown at the same time. So feel free to use the closed captioning. Finally, if there are any questions while you're listening to the presentations or the discussion, please type them out in the chat box. And after the presenter's discussion with Dr. Shahbaz, I'm positive that there will be a chance for them to answer those questions. Yes, and with that, I would like to introduce our presenters and discussant. So today's presenters, Mehdi Ganjavi received his PhD from the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at University of Toronto. His work focuses on the cultural Cold War, history of translation, print, publication, and the politics of archive and historiography in contemporary Middle East. Ganjavi is a former PEN Canada writer in residence at George Brown College and a graduate of Masters of Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. His scholarly writings have appeared in the Encyclopedia Iranica, Iranian Studies, and Review of the Middle East Studies. Excuse me. In the last 7 years, Dr. Ganjavi edited, reintroduced, and oversaw the publication of seven little-known Persian novels published or produced from 1920s to 1940s. These novels shed light on the origins of science fiction, detective fiction, historical and utopian fiction in Persian. He recently has finalized and submitted the first critical edition of Henriyah Translation, about which he and Mr. Alipour will be speaking in detail tonight. The oldest Persian translation of 1001 Nights, which is forthcoming with Manya Honar, which I assume is the publisher. And Mr. Meisam Alipour, novelist and a scholar, is a graduate of Master of Arts Studies from Tehran University of Art and Bachelor of Graphics Design from Enqilab Tehran University. His research focuses on modern Persian literature, Iranian painting, and Quran manuscripts during the Abbasid era. And today's discussant is Pegah Shahbaz. Dr. Shahbaz is a specialist of Persian literature of Iran, Central and South Asia. She is currently a SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, the Asian Institute, an associate member of Centre d'études et de recherche sur l'Inde, l'Asie du Sud et sa diaspora, or CSAS, Center for the Studies of India, South Asia, and their diaspora, at the Université du Québec à Montréal, and the section editor of the Fables and Tales chapter of Perso-Indica project. She works on the questions of narratology, women and gender studies, translation, and systems of knowledge transmission in the Persianate world, in particular, the reception and domestication of Indian religious and cultural heritage in Persianate literary culture. So please join me in welcoming our presenters and discussant. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Ganjavi to start his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Ganjavi, Mr. Alipour, and Dr. Shahbaz for joining us. Mehdi Jan, please.
Thank you, Mustafa Jan, for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here joining all these dearest panelists to discuss Henriyah Translation. I also am thankful to all the participants and those who are listening. I really look forward to this session and discussion after our presentation. So let me just share my screen, and then I will follow with the presentation. Yes. And please, if there was any issue with the voice or Mustafa Jan, please let me know.
So, by all means, Mehdi Jan, by all means, thank you.
Yeah. In this talk, I will historicize and explore the lesser-known Henriyah Translation, Tarjumah Henriyah, the earliest translation of 1001 Nights into Persian, patronized by Henry Russell, 2nd Baronet, British resident in Hyderabad, Mohammad Baqir Khurasani Bazanjiri, born around 1770, finalized his translation in 1814, almost 3 decades before Abdul Latif Tasuji embarks on a similar project in Iran. Overlooked by historians of literature, Henriyah Translation happens to be not only the earliest Persian translation, but one which is based on a significantly older, arguably authentic family of Alf Layla Wa-Layla Arabic manuscripts. Through manuscript and archival study and textual analysis of the 2 manuscripts available from this translation, my research will narrate an interregional story remained hidden for 2 centuries about nights in Persian. Up until a few years ago, historians of Persian literature had assumed that the earliest Persian translation of Alf Layla Wa-Layla is the one by Abdul Latif Tasuji, patronized by Prince Bahman Mirza, whose image you can see on the slide, the 4th son of Abbas Mirza. Tasuji finished his translation in 1843. It appears that Tasuji himself was under the impression that his translation was the first attempt in translating this text. In his brief introduction to the translation, Tasuji writes, "گرچه مطالبات کتاب الف لیله و لیلا ندما را به کار آید و اشعارش ادبا را بلاغت افزاید و خاص و عام به خواندن و شنودن آن رغبت دارند." But until that time, which is the reign of the Muhammad Shah during the Qajar era, کسی به ترجمه فارسی الف لیله و لیلا نپرداخته بود تا همه کس بهریاب توانند شد, which in sum means that nobody had attempted to translate 1001 Night by the time he finished his version. Later, highly decorated versions of Tasuji's translation were produced during Nasr ad-Din Shah's reign, and according to accounts from his court, such as the account by Heinrich Brugsch, second Prussian Consul General of the German Customs Union in Persia, this translation was specifically illustrated by Sani ul Mulk for the sake of Mahduliya, Nasr ad-Din Shah's mother. The images you can see on this slide are actually copies of the illustrations by Sani ul Mulk. This historical assumption that Tasuji's translation is the earliest one is commonly repeated in numerous Persian and English articles. In 2004, Ulrich Marzolf, in his article, The Persian Nights, Links Between the Arabian Nights and Iranian Culture, listed 4 uninvestigated manuscripts of Alf Layla in Persian held in Medina, Tehran, Berlin, and India, and suggested that there might be translations earlier than Tasuji's. Of these 4, Marzolf described 2 in more details. One is a manuscript with 102 folios held in Alipour in India. It is translated by a certain Ohad ibn Ahmad Belgarani and finished in 1836. Another one is an undated one, held in SSHRC Bibliothek Berlin, which has 118 folios, and its translator is a certain Mirza Zain al-Abidin Khan Neyshaburi. Yet now, we know that there are at least 2 more manuscripts, which were not listed even by Marzolf. These 2 manuscripts, about which I will talk in more details, show that the earliest translation of Alf Layla into Persian compared to Tasuji's had a significantly different geographical origin and, in a sense, an unlikely patron. These 2 manuscripts reveal that 3 decades before Tasuji, it was Mohammad Baqir Khurasani Bazanjiri who translated a manuscript of Alf Layla Wa-Layla into Persian, a version with 276 nights. Gladly, Mohammad Baqir Khurasani has shared some details about his life in his introductory translator note. He was born in Bazanjir, a village in Khorasan, around 1770. As we know, at the time, Persian was still a prominent literary and administrative language in Deccan, as well as in most Mughal India. Baqir Khurasani, as he says, bested Aya Abeshkhar be Muqtazay Sarnevesht, arrived at Hyderabad in his 40s, probably around 1810. A month after his arrival, he gets connected to the British nobility residing in Hyderabad. He writes, که با بعض اکابر و اعاظم و برخی از اشراف و اعیان سلسله جلیله انگلیس با فرهنگ و تمیز نام و نشان شناخت ظاهر و هویدا و راه و رسم شناسا دمخور شده و از خوان احسانشان کامیاب و بهره ور شده. Khurasani starts working as a Persian secretary for Henry Russell, 2nd Baronet. Khurasani notes that as he is finishing his translation, it is 4 years that he is working for Henry Russell. So the year of the completion of this translation should be 1814, which further goes well with Khurasani's assertion that at the time Henry Russell was in his early 30s. Interestingly, Alf Layla Wa-Layla, translating Alf Layla Wa-Layla into Persian was a project patronized by Henry Russell. The translator, Baqir Khurasani, notes in his introduction to the translation that he had a 2-volume Arabic manuscript, which he used as his original and embarked on this translation when Henry Russell was the East India Company's resident in Hyderabad. The translation was also encouraged and supported morally by Henry's brother, Charles Russell, who was temporarily responsible for the residency's business when Henry Russell was in Pune. خراسانی praises Charles Russell and writes صاحب فرخنده ذات و خجست صفات هم با کمالات سوری و معنوی هم آغوش و با اخلاق نیک و پسندیده همدوش بوده و در گفتگو و بیان به سخن هندی توانا و با زبان ایرانیان آشنا و با خبر از کتب نقلی چون تواریخ و از علوم عقلی چون حساب و هندسی. On the occasion of the coming back of Henry Russell from Pune to Hyderabad, Khurasani dedicates his translation to Henry Russell, who was باعث اولین و سبب نخستین در ترجمه و تبیین, who was the person who first originated or initiated this project. And Khurasani named the translation Tarjumah Henriyah Translation. Khurasani finishes his dedicatory translator notes with a qasida celebrating the return of Henry Russell to Hyderabad. The first bait of or matla of this qasida is شاد باشه دل که اینک مژده جان آمده دردمند هجر را از وصل درمان آمده. But who was Henry Russell? He was son of Henry Russell, first Baronet. His father was a British lawyer and the Chief Justice of Bengal. Henry Russell was the second Baronet, was the resident of East India Company between 1810 to 1821. William Dalrymple, in his study, describes Henry Russell and many others like him as white Mughals, British agents who were so mingled with Indian culture that 1 in 3 would marry Indian women. According to Dalrymple, the memoirs of many of the British travelers to India shows that the Indian lists of such white Mughals was sometimes more astonishing to British travels of the time. The Mughal miniature that you see here is a rare one in the sense that it depicts, probably completed by Ray Venkatachalam in early 800s, the man in the center Baronet. Henry Russell's life is no less than of 1001 Nights stories. He seduced the widow of his birth and had an affair with an Indian woman whom I will come back later. Russell had a daughter from an Indian woman which he sent to a friend to be raised without ever introducing himself to his girl. Russell's position as the British resident in Hyderabad also ended abruptly as he was pushed to resign from the residency to avert an investigation for corruption, which would possibly lead to his disgraceful removal from office. The archive of the Russell family of Swallowfield, Berkshire, is now held at Oxford. It includes 65 boxes, among which are papers of Sir Henry Russell, second Baronet, including correspondence with his brother Charles Russell. The descriptive catalogue of his funds yet do not include any reference to a copy of Alf Layla or to Baghir Khurasani. The English biographers of the two brothers, including Dalrymple, have also never pointed to their role in patronizing the first Persian translation of Alf Layla Wa-Layla. This funds is an unexplored archival source which might help with understanding the literary affairs of these two brothers and might include clues to the fate of the original manuscript, which is, as I will discuss later, which is unfortunately lost at this point, and its translator. One question which I have had a hard time answering is that why Henry Russell and his brother patronized this translation. We know that in the 19th century, there was an interest and a manuscript market for Arabic manuscripts of Alf Layla, a market which as I will be discussing later, even resulted in proliferation of Alf Layla manuscripts and many additions to centuries-old stories. But this Arabic manuscript market cannot easily answer why Henry Russell would patronize the Persian version. One assumption is that he might have intended to use this translation for Persian learning, as Alf Layla itself was being used as a tool to teach Arabic to British agents in Calcutta. Another guess is that Henry Russell might have had a personal interest in Persian. This painting is Khairun-Nisa Begum. She was married to James Ashles Kirkpatrick, British resident in Hyderabad. Khairun-Nisa was granddaughter of Nawab Mahmud Ali Khan, the ruler of Hyderabad. When Kirkpatrick died, Henry Russell, who was his secretary at the time, replaced him. According to Dalrymple, Henry Russell seduced Khairun-Nisa on the funeral of her husband. However, while Khairun-Nisa knew Persian, Henry Russell only knew Urdu. Thus, it is possible that Henry was in need of a Persian-speaking secretary to help him with writing his letters to her. Could it be that Khurasani or another secretary before him played such a role? There is no proof to support this guess. Still, while this is just a speculation, but what this affair reveals is that Persian was not only an administrative language to Russell, it was also a language of desire. That is to say, the language of the young Russell's hidden affair. Now let me move to the Arabic manuscripts of Alf Layla. What makes Khurasani's translation more important is that it not only predates Tasuji's and is different with it in terms of its linguistic style, but also that Khurasani's translation is arguably from a different and older family of Alf Layla manuscripts. To expand on this, let us now move to briefly discuss the history of Alf Layla manuscripts. There have been several studies on the Arabic manuscripts of Alf Layla Wa-Layla. The roots of Alf Layla Wa-Layla stories are varied and include stories with Indian, Persian, and Arabic roots. Masoudi and Ibn al-Nadim have referred to a Persian book entitled Hezar Afsan as the source of the first Arabic version. Unfortunately, no copy of Hezar Afsan has remained. A 9th century fragment in Chicago University, which you can see in the slide, is nowadays the oldest fragment at hand of a book called Alf Layla, not Alf Layla Wa-Layla, but only Alf Layla. Most probably Alf Layla, literally meaning 1,000 nights, is a translation of the lost Hezar Afsan, and thus the narrative ancestor to Alf Layla Wa-Layla. The first time the name Alf Layla Wa-Layla, with adding that ending night, Wa-Layla, has appeared in historical sources is in 12th century. As Mohsen Mehdi, Arabist and editor of Alf Layla Wa-Layla, has shown, the Alf Layla Wa-Layla manuscripts can be divided into two branches, the Syrian tradition and the Egyptian one. The Syrian tradition refers to the older manuscripts, such as the 14th or maybe 15th century Golland manuscript, the page of which you can see in the slide, which is now held at Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. There are as few as 4 Syrian manuscripts at hand, and all share stylistic characteristics, have around 280 nights, and include similar core stories. These earlier Syrian tradition implies that there must have been a modern version of Alf Layla Wa-Layla written down in second half of 13th century, either in Syria or Egypt. The Egyptian branch of Alf Layla Wa-Layla manuscripts has mainly developed in and after the 17th century. So basically the Syrian one are earlier ones around 14 and 15, and the Egyptian branch around after 17th century. And in the context of the growing desire by the Orientalists to acquire a more complete version of Alf Layla Wa-Layla, copyists of the Ottoman era started to add freely to the Alf Layla Wa-Layla in response to this manuscript market potentials. This has resulted in many 18th and 19th century manuscripts, which have added stories from different sources with stylistic differences and reflecting a variety of layers of society to make their version of Alf Layla Wa-Layla literally 1001 nights. The Egyptian branch, thus, has been heavily shaped by the folk and oral tradition of the Ottoman era. Consequently, the Egyptian branch, quote, from Hadavi in his translation of Alf Layla, delete or modify passages that exist in Syrian manuscripts, add others, and indiscriminately borrow from each other. While the Syrian manuscripts are stylistically homogeneous, the Egyptian ones are heterogeneous. The above was a brief look at the history of Arabic manuscripts of Alf Layla Wa-Layla. When we look at the history of the print versions of Alf Layla, it becomes clear that it was the Egyptian family of manuscript which became the dominant one in print. The first print of Alf Layla Wa-Layla was in 2 volumes in 1814 and 1818 in Fort William College. Its editor was Sheikh Ahmed ibn Muhammad Shirwani al-Yamani, the Arabic instructor in this college. While most probably this print was based on a Syrian manuscript, but the editor liberally altered the text, removed several passages, paragraphs, and in many cases changed the colloquial language of the text to a literary one. Next print version of Alf Layla Wa-Layla is known as Breslau edition. This edition was a result of combining an earlier Syrian manuscript with later Egyptian ones. Next is Bolagh edition. Bolagh was printed in 1835, edited by Abdul Rahman al-Sharqawi and based on an Egyptian manuscript. Not only the source was a late manuscript, but the editor also liberally changed and altered the language of the text. Between 1839 and 1842, the second edition of Calcutta was printed. This edition, known as Calcutta II, it was also based on an Egyptian manuscript copied as late as 1829. Calcutta II's editor, William McNaughton, have altered its content and style rather freely. Bolagh edition and the second edition of Calcutta became the dominant Arabic printed versions because of their quote, complete end quote appearance, this so-called completeness. Many of the translation of Alf Layla to Wa-Layla to various languages are based on either of these 2 versions. Clearly, Tasuji's Persian translation is also based on an Egyptian manuscript. My textual study of the Henriyah translation, however, reveals that it has been translated not from a later Egyptian manuscript, but from an earlier Syrian one. This is quite remarkable, given the fact that, as noted before, there are only a few Arabic texts of the Syrian tradition available, and as this tradition is older, homogeneous, and arguably more authentic in comparison with the later Egyptian versions. I've compared Henriyah translation with Golan manuscript, and there are many similarities other than the number of nights, around 280, the main stories, their order, and the narrative structure in the 4 Syrian manuscripts align well with Khurasani's translation. Like the Syrian family, Khurasani's translations also abruptly end in the middle. Translation, Henriyah translation has 12 master stories, the first 6 of which each include other stories within them. Thus far, I have been able to locate 2 copies of Henriyah translation. One has been part of Sir Edward Henry Winfield collection, which were bequeathed to the Indian Institute of. Much grateful to Dr. Pegah Shahbaz for that she kindly informed me of this copy. And later it was transferred to the Bodleian Library. Sir Edward Henry Winfield is commonly known as a pioneer translator of Persian classical literature, such as the works of Rumi and Khayyam into English. His collection reveals that Winfield was not only a literary translator, but also a manuscript collector. His collection includes 83 manuscripts. Currently, our knowledge of Winfield's possible regional and local sources in his collection development are not sufficient. Winfield's copy of Henriyah translation includes 583 folios and is written in the Iranian style Nastali. The second copy of Henriyah Translation is held at Houghton Library, Harvard University, manuscript Persian 11. This manuscript has 557 folios and is written in an Indian-style nastali. Its former owner had been Mary Pratt, who gifted it to Harvard College along with another 59 manuscripts back in 1915, few months after the death of his brother, Dr. Herbert G. Pratt. It seems that Herbert G. Pratt had been a manuscript collector too. While I have not been able to find the list of all the 60 manuscripts collected by Herbert Pratt, 8 of them are now at Houghton. These 8 include 2 divans of Hafiz, 2 manuscripts of Sa'di, 1 divan by Anvari, and 1 by Sa'ib Tabrizi, and a copy of the famous story Mehr and Mushtari. Gladly, we have some information on Herbert G. Pratt. His classmate during his time at Harvard College back in 1863 has written a short biography of Pratt. Herbert Pratt graduated from Harvard Medical School July 1868. After graduating from the medical school, he went to Europe and studied in Vienna and Berlin. At one time, he opened an office to practice his profession in Denver, Colorado, but soon went back to Europe for further study and travel. From 1874, for nearly 40 years, he continued to live abroad and travel year by year until he had investigated the greater, as quotable, the greater part of the habitable world, largely in an unconventional way, and with a keen appreciation for manners and customs, for scenery and architecture. The manuscript at Bodleian Library, when we compare these 2 manuscripts in terms of their content and scribal, especially in terms of scribal errors and the nights that each include, the manuscript at Bodleian Library has significantly lesser scribal errors, and it includes 2 nights which are missing in the Harvard manuscript. A close critical and textual analysis of the 2 manuscripts further shows that none of the 2 has been copied from the other. Most probably, both have been copied from the original manuscript, which might have been lost, or at least till now, I haven't been able to find a clue where it might be. I started to transcribe Henriyah Translation and later invited my dearest friend Meisam to help me in the process. Hopefully in less than a few months, the first critical edition of Henriyah Translation based on these 2 manuscripts will be published. I contend that this text is an unexplored window to the transregional and transnational Persian literature, translational practices, and book production in the colonial India. As discussed in this presentation, patronized by Bahman Mirza at Qajar Prince, Tasuji's translation is based on the Arabic text of Egyptian tradition and employs a simple late Qajar Persian. Henriyah Translation, however, was produced in colonial India, patronized by the British resident, and Baqir Khurasani has based his work on a Syrian manuscript to translate it to an outstanding Indian-style Persian. These stylistic and thematic differences will be explored in more details by my colleague and friend Meisam in his presentation. Thank you so much for listening to this talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganjavi, Mehdi Aziz, for your talk on this fascinating topic. So at this point, I would like to invite Meisam Alipour. Meisam جان، ممنون میشم که سخنرانیتون رو شروع بفرمایید.
سلام، صدای من میاد؟
بله صداتون میاد. میخواید دوباره لطف کنید صحبت؟ خواهش می‌کنم.
آره این بیاد اول.
الان صداتون خیلی بهتر شد، خیلی بهتر شد.
خب خدا رو شکر. اول سلام میکنم خدمت همه. من به خاطر اینکه به فارسی میگم و قرار ترجمه بشه از متن میخونم تا راحت تر باشه. ترجمه هنریه نسخه‌ای ناقص اما منحصر به فرد. در این وقت محدود میخوام از اهمیت نسخه هنریه بگویم که تاریخ ترجمهش به پیش از ترجمه مشهور تسوجی میرسد. علاوه بر قدمت این ترجمه، بررسی ساختار روایت این نسخه نشان میدهد که ما با ترجمه یکی از قدیمی ترین نسخه های بازمانده از 1001 شب روبرویم. نسخه ای که حاوی پرحجم ترین داستان های 1001 شب همچون داستان حمال و 3 دختر، داستان دو وزیر، داستان علی ابن بکار و شمس النهار، داستان علی نورالدین علی و انیس جلیس، داستان ملک بدر و گلنار دریایی، داستان اهدب، خیاط، طبیب، یهودی و دیگران و چند داستان دیگر که در ادامه هسته اصلی 1001 شب، داستان 2 برادر، 2 شاهزاده، شاه زمان شهریار، 2 خواهر، 2 وزیرزاده، شهرزاد، دنیازاد می آید. خصیصه مهمی که ما را به یاد تحقیق مفصل 1000 افسان کجاست از بهرام بیضایی می اندازد. تحقیقی که در رد مقاله پروفسور آریش مارزولف با نام 1001 شب و فرهنگ ایرانی نگاشته شده است. برخلاف مارزولف که به گسست این رابطه پرداخت، بیضایی در صدد روشن‌تر کردن رابطه فرهنگ ایرانی پهلوی با الف لیلا و-لیلا عربی است. بیضایی در این تحقیق با اتکا به سند متقدم الفهرست از اثری یاد می‌کند که 1000 افسان نامیده می‌شود. 1000 افسان یا 1000 دستان که پیش از ابن ندیم و شاید در دوره متقدم عباسیان که هنوز ترکان ماورانهر و امیران ترک جای وزیران ایرانی را نگرفته بودند، به عربی ترجمه شده و مؤلف الفهرست آن را به دفعات و تمامه خوانده و میگوید 200 داستان، کمتر از 200 داستان دارد. سخنی که بی‌شباهت به نظر مسعودی مورخ قرن 4 نیست. آنجا که از کتاب مشهور در عرب با نام 1000 افسان یاد می‌کند، کتابی آنقدر معروف که جهشیاری را بران می‌دارد تا اثری با الگوی 1000 افسان بنویسد، اما عمرش کفاف نمی‌دهد و تنها به نوشتن 480 شب می‌پردازد. از این مقدمه کوتاه قصد دارم تا بگویم 1001 شب نبودن روایت این نسخه را نباید بر ناتمامی اثر فرض بگیریم، زیرا برخلاف علاقه محققین امروز به تعداد شبها که در 1001 شب کامل می شود و مستلزم پایانی خوش است، می توان بر مفهوم اصطلاحی 1000 بر یک دوره بسیار زیاد و بر خارج از شمارش و از این دست تاکید کرد. با این نگاه می‌خواهم به جای ناکاملی اثر فرض بگیرم که این نسخه می‌تواند رونوشتی از ورژن‌های ابتدایی الف و لیلا باشد، ورژن‌هایی که هنوز هم مغم مؤلفین، راویان، نقالان و قصه‌گویان آن، جذابیت داستانی و سرگرم کردن افراد در ایام فراغت بود، خصوصا در شب‌های بلند زمستان که کشاورزی انجام نمی‌گرفت. ورژن هایی که علاقهشان به اصل روایت و اهمیت ندادنشان به پایان باعث می شد تا پیشرفت در داستان به صورت لابیرنت های روایی و قصه های لایه به لایه بروز کند. ورژن هایی برخلاف نسخه های متأخر که تمایلشان به رساندن شبها به تعداد 1001 شب سبب شده تا از داستان های سرراست و کوتاه، داستان های مطلواره و حتی حکایات تاریخی نیز استفاده کنند، مانند حکایت عشق به خرس که بیشک از حکایات محلی مصر نشأت می‌گیرد و آن را می‌توان در پایان بندیش، آنجا که وردان قصاب با پول زن دکانی در بازار می‌خرد، مشاهده کرد. آن بازار هنوز هست و به بازار وردان می‌شناسندش. و یا حکایت طفیلی در دربار خلیفه که عیناً از متن تاریخی مروج الذهب مسعودی گرفته شده، با این تفاوت که به جای مأمون خلیفه‌ای که داستان در زمانش رخ داده، هارون الرشید را نشان دهند تا الگوی خلیفه اسطوره‌ای و پرقدرت بغداد در 1001 شب حفظ شود. همچنین داستان اسحاق وزیر و ورودش به منزلی بیگانه به بهانه دیدار دستی که دل و دین وزیر نوازنده اوز را رو بوده است. داستانی که علاقه به 1001 ساخت سبب شد تا مصنفی فراموش کنند این داستان را نیز پیشتر آورده. همچنین قصد دارم با اشاره به جملات پایان هر شب و آغاز شب بعد که به ابتدایی بودن روایت انجام میده، دلیل دیگر برای فرض قدیمی بودن ورژنی که ترجمه از آن صورت پذیرفته بیاورم. تا پیش از شناخته شدن این نسخه، ما با 3 نسخه فارسی چاپی از نسخه های مختلف 1001 شب روبرویم. نخستین آنها که به دست عبداللطیف تسوجی صورت پذیرفته، به خاطر قدمت، نثر جذاب و شعرهایی که سروش اصفهانی برای اشعار متن انتخاب کرده، یک خواندنی ترین ترجمه های 1001 شب است. دو دیگر ترجمه ابراهیم اقلیدی است که به واسطه تطبیق نسخه های متعدد عربی، انگلیسی، فرانسه علاوه بر ترجمه اهمیت تحقیقی نیز دارد و سومین آنها توسط محمد رضا مرعشی‌پور از روی نسخه بولاق انجام شد و بنا به گفتگوی شفاهی مترجم با من فاقد سانسورهای سگانه است که در متن تسوجی خلل ایجاد می‌کند. سانسورهایی که نخست توسط خود مترجم تسوجی صورت گرفت و تمامی رابطه‌های عاشقانه همجنس با همجنس را تغییر داد. دومین مرحله سانسور به دست اعتمادالسلطنه رئیس اداره انطباعات به دلیل مغایرت با عرف انجام پذیرفت و سومین دوره سانسورها توسط اداره ممیزی کتاب در عصر حاضر. در این 3 نوع ترجمه ما با 3 نوع از حضور شهر دنیازاد به عنوان یار قهرمان و یاور راوی مواجهیم. در متن 1001 شب دنیازاد با تشویق شهرزاد خواهان آن است تا داستان ادامه یابد، کنشی یادآورانه که هدفش نه شهرزاد بلکه شهریار است. در ادامه این کنش نمایشی شهرزاد میل به زنده ماندن و ادامه دادن روایت را به اجازه شهریار موکول می کند، هرچند که می داند با یادآوری دنیازاد شهریار همچون مخاطبان داستان بیش از هر کسی مشتاق شنیدن باقی مانده داستان است. این رفتار دنیازاد و بازی که توسط شهرزاد تکمیل می شود در متن تسوجی گهگاه رخ می دهد. به نظر می رسد که مصنفین این ورژن به اندازه‌ای از مهارت در داستان پردازی رسیدند که گهگاه با اشاره به دنیازاد به یاد مخاطبینشان می اندازند که ما اگرچه در راهروهای داستان‌هایی از درون داستان‌های دیگر حرکت می‌کنیم، اما هنوز درون فرم جادویی 1001 شب قرار داریم. اما در متن اقلیدی بعد از پیشرفت داستان دیگر کمتر از دنیازاد و نقش یاری رسان او اثری هست. همانند متن اقلیدی، متن مرعشی‌پور نیز به زودی این نقش را حذف کرده و تنها به ذکر شب پایان یافت و شهرزاد سکوت کرد و نیز شب آغاز شد و شهرزاد سخن گفت بسنده می‌کند. اما در ترجمه محمد باقر خراسانی بزنجردی از ابتدا تا قبل از داستان‌های پایانی با حضور شهرزاد و دنیازاد تشویق کننده او روبروییم. بعد از پایان هر شب و سکوت شهرزاد می‌خوانیم که خواهرش دنیازاد گفت ای خواهر، چه نیکو و شیرین است سخنوریت و چه دلکش و مرغوب است حکایت گستریت. شهرزاد گفت اگر پادشاه از کشتنم بگذرد به اون الله تعالی شب آینده سخن اعجب و اقرب از این بهر شما بیان می‌نمایم. سپس عنوان شب آتی می‌آید تا دیگر بار دنیازاد در مقام یار قهرمان حاضر شود و بگوید ای خواهر اگر بیداری قصه دوشینه را به انجام رساند، عملی که همواره با حباً و کرامتاً شهرزاد همراه است و ادامه داستان شب گذشته. جملات دنیازاد اگرچه در شبها تغییر می‌کند اما همواره با همین الگو بیان می شود. نخست، با تقدیر از جذابیت داستان که به طور ضمنی تشویق شهرزاد در خود دارد، شهرزاد تحریک شده و بگوید منتظر بهتر از این باشید و سپس در شب بعد خواهش از شهرزاد برای ادامه تا این شب ما به داستان سرای تو به سرایت و قبول شهرزاد برای ادامه. تکرار هر شبه این اتفاق برخلاف سایر نسخه ها اگرچه ممکن است برای ذوق و ذهن آزموده ما مخاطبان قرن 21 کسل کننده بیاید، اما حکایت دارد از شکل ابتدایی روایت و عدم مهارت راوی. همچنین برخورد محمد باقر خراسانی بزنجری با شعرهای مجموعه نیز ویژگی خاص دیگری به ترجمه هنریه می‌دهد. تا امروز مخاطبان فارسی 1001 شب با یک شیوه از تبدیل اشعار روبرو بودند و آن استفاده از گنجینه شعر فارسی گویان. این روش تبدیل در ترجمه های فارسی به دو نوع بروز یافته است. یک، استفاده از شعرای کلاسیک فارسی که توسط سروش اصفهانی در ترجمه تسوجی صورت گرفت و بیشک بر زیبایی ترجمه افزوده است. دو، استفاده از شعرای مدرن فارسی که توسط آخرین مترجم فارسی علیپور صورت گرفته و اگرچه برای ذهن مخاطب فارسی ناشناست، اما از زیرکی و استراتژی مترجم در قرن 20 حکایت دارد. و اما در ترجمه هنریه ما با ترجمه اشعار توسط مترجم برویم، ترجمه از نظم به نظم، و پرواضح است که این شیوه با توجه به محدودیت توان شاعر میتواند تونالیتی از شعر خوب تا شعر ضعیف را در بر بگیرد. با این وجود عمل مترجم خصیصه ویژه به اثر داده است و آن در کنار انطباق حداکثری و نعل به نعل بین اشعار فارسی و عربی فضای عینی شعر هاست. اشعاری با تشبیهات حسی و فاقد پیچیدگی، ساده، روان و عاری از ترکیبات دشوار که با صداقت و صراحت لهجه نزدیکترین معانی را به دست می‌دهد. به عنوان مثال، مجو دوستی در زمان ذکر است که در تنگیت نیست فریاد رس، تو تنها نشین باش بی هم نشین، همین پند من مر تو را هست و بس. و در نهایت میخواهم به نکته اشاره کنم که دلیلش هنوز برای من نامعلوم است. تقریباً از 1/4 نهایی نسخه ما با حذف نام شبها و حذف نقش دنیازاد و دیالوگ‌های میان او و شهرزاد روبرو می‌شویم. در این بخش با حذف نام شب تنها نیم سطر سپید و نانوشته گذاشته می‌شود که بنا به سنت خود کاتب باید 1 سطر بود و این اتفاق احتمالاتی را پیش روی ما می‌گذارد. آیا قرار بود خط و قلم عنوان شبها تغییر کند و آیا قرار بود کلمات دیگری به جای عنوان شبها آن جای خالی را پر کنند؟ این اتفاق به شکل عجیب‌تر در داستان قمرالزمان رخ می‌دهد. داستان که با نظم پیشین نسخه ها پیش می‌رفت به یک بار قطع شده و دوباره از ابتدا و به شکل دیگرگون روایت می‌شود. آرام آرام نقش شهرزاد راوی نیز کمتر و کمتر می‌شود تا آنجا که حتی گهگاه با حذف نام شهرزاد تنها نوشته شده گفت و یا به این نوع حکایت گذاری پرداخته و غیره. این روند در داستان غانم به منتهای خود میرسد. در داستان غانم حتی در همین نزدیکی های حداقلی نیز از میان برداشته می شود و شهرزاد راوی داستان را از ابتدا تا به انتها بدون هیچ پایان شبی یا آغاز شبی دیگر تعریف می کند تا در نهایت بگوید چون شهرزاد گزارش پسر ابو ایوب را به انجام رسانید، شهریار سلطان شهریار خرمی و سرور خویش را اظهار کرد. ملکه کشور داستان سرایی گفت ای خداوند، هرگاه از این چنین خوشنودی تمنای آن دارم که حکایت زین الاسام و شاه اجنه را که از آن افزونی خوشنودی میتوانی حاصل نمود بشنوی. به نظر میرسد قرار است نظم شب به شب و 1001 شبی جای خود را به نظم به داستان بدهد که متاسفانه روند کتابت یا ترجمه قطع می شود. ما تنها با تغییراتی روبروییم که در پی چند داستان آخر رخ داده و در داستان غانم تمام و کمال متجلی شده است. قصد دارم صحبت خود را با چند پرسش در این خصوص پایان دهم که شاید راهگشای تحقیقات آتی باشد. چگونه می توانیم روند تغییر از شکل 1001 شبی داستان‌ها به شکل داستان به داستان را توضیح دهیم؟ آیا باید نقش سفارش دهنده انگلیسی را در این تغییر پررنگ کرد؟ یعنی آیا توصیه‌ای از طرف وی یا از طرف هر انگلیسی زبان دیگری که هم صحبت مترجم بوده شده است؟ آیا شرحی از روند داستان مدرن فرنگستان یا انگلستان برای مترجم به انجام رسیده که او را بران داشته تا چنین تغییری را در ترجمه متن 1001 شب بدهد؟ با توجه به مهجور ماندن این نسخه آیا می توانیم این تغییر را آغاز یا آستانه‌ای برای داستان مدرن فارسی بدانیم؟ ممنونم.
مرسی میثم عزیز. خیلی عذر میخوام، من باید با کانی صحبت داشته باشم که ایشون متوقف نکنن ترانسکریپتو، چون یه خورده از شما عقب بودن. Thank you very much میثم جان. کانی you might want to continue. جان خواهش میکنم. You might want to continue because we're a little bit behind in terms of closed captioning. So if anyone has been following the closed captioning, so let's wait for those to finish. You might want to like add more texts. And by the way, like for attendees, especially those who have been using the closed captioning, there's, I think, an option called view full transcript where you could see like the transcripts all at the same time. So out of respect for these attendees, we'll just wait a couple more minutes so Connie can finish this, and then I'll intervene again to continue with the discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, Connie. Thank you for your kind help. Thank you, Meisam John. So at this point, I would like to invite Pegah Aziz, Dr. Shahbaz to join us, join Mehdi and Meisam for a discussion about their presentation. Thank you, Pegah, for joining us.
Hello, everybody. I'm very glad to be part of this panel this evening. And I would like to say big congratulations to our two contributors for having accomplished such an important and invaluable publishing project. So to begin the discussion, I would like to draw attentions to what was happening at the same time in Europe. As it was mentioned already in the presentations, Antoine Galland's French translation of Alf Layla Wa-Layla, entitled Les Mille et Une Nuits, was published in 12 volumes at the beginning of the 18th century, from 1704 to 1717 in Europe. And that was the beginning of the Romantic literary movement in the whole Europe. So this book introduced the Oriental literature and narrative style with this framing structure, labyrinthine structure, as you mentioned, having stories retold within one another to the European audience. Beside that, these stories included huge amount of imagery, marvelous creatures, which they found very interesting for the education of their youth. I will read what William Weber says in his book, Tales of the East. He says, "It may be safely asserted that such fictions, such as the magic lamp of Aladdin and the cavern of the 40 thieves, have contributed more to the amusement and delight of every succeeding generation since the fortunate appearance of these tales in this quarter of the world than all the works which the industry and imagination of Europeans have provided for the instruction and entertainment of youth." Antoine Galland's translation was rendered into many other languages, including English. So in 1814, the date mentioned for the accomplishment of Tarjumah Hinrīyah, we already had the English translation of Alf Layla Wa-Layla, 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights Entertainments, prepared by Jonathan Scott in 1811. And before this work, he, who was also a member of the East India Company, who had also traveled several times to India, he had, before accomplishing this translation, he had translated another series of Persian tales entitled Bahar Danish, into English, and he called it Spring of Knowledge, not Bahar. Yes, Garden of Knowledge instead of Spring of Knowledge. So what happens is that already in the beginning of the 19th century, the European milieu is very well acquainted with Alf Layla Wa-Layla. And talking of Henry Russell, a white Mughal who was privileged to return to England or to Scotland and get trained, educated there, he was certainly familiar with the current literary trends in Europe. So it might help us understand what his intention was for commissioning such a translation in India to a Persian, native Persian Munshi. Because as you said, he already knew Hindi, Persian, and Arabic. So his intention might not have been linguistic acquisition. Do you think, so one question is, do you think he thought he was producing sort of literature in this Persian language? Or do you think he thought he was somehow supplying material for entertainment in Persian language? So it needs a bit more reflection. My main questions are, to what extent do you think the translator, Khurasani, Persianized the text through translation? Because you mentioned the nazm, the poetry embedded within the prose. I would like to know his translation method. Did he translate the verses into verse? Did he render prose into verse? Vice versa? How much Arabic has he already preserved in the text? To what extent do you think this text is decorated, like in Nasr Fanni, as we see using Arabic words, or how much do you think it has been simplified and become more accessible for a more general audience? And I would be grateful if you could read a passage from the text to give us an example, a more tangible example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shahbaz, for this invaluable contextualization of the translation in English and in French. And I learned a lot from your contextualization. In terms of answering to your first question, there is a difference between the way Dalrymple, as one of the main biographers of, or one who studies Henry Russell in detail in his book, discusses the language skills of Henry Russell, and the way Mohammad Baqir Khurasani in his translatory note describes Russell. It's Dalrymple, as I said in my presentation, believes that Russell only knew Urdu, not Persian. But when we look at the translator's note, it seems that Baqir Khurasani attributes Persian Persian language skills to both Charles and Henry, specifically to Charles Russell, the younger brother. So this is one of the the differences between these two. I really hope that at some point, through going to that funds that I mentioned at Oxford University, Bodleian, the Russell Family Funds, we can get a more accurate answer to his possible knowledge of Persian, as well as the fate of this Persian Munshi or other Persian Munshis at the time in his court, to see what was the nature and the varied forms of his relation with this language. The only thing that, I try to, in my presentation, to foreground at least his personal relations, to show that personally and in terms of, his romantic life and personal life, he had been acquainted with, the girls with, to whom he needed Persian to communicate. But then in terms of the language, whether the text has been, what is the role of Persian, or how much Arabic can we see in this translation? Usually what happens in the Arabic is mainly, we can only find Arabic sections when it comes to Arabic verse. So usually the translator does not bring in more Arabic than when it comes to Arabic verse. And when it comes to that, usually what he does is that he first starts with the Arabic verse, and then followed sometimes by that verse into Persian prose, and then followed by that Persian prose into Persian poetry. So he does it in both the layer of translating it to Persian prose and then followed by Persian poetry. And sometimes, as the manuscripts, the nights go and we arrive at later folios of the manuscript, he does not translate it to Persian prose, but he just puts the Arabic verse and then followed by the Persian verse. I can ask, maybe, as you said, just hearing a section or paragraph from the text itself can help us get a more concrete example of how he has translated the text. If Meisam John, میثم جان اگر شما میتونین یه بخشی رو از متن بر ما بخونین. Yeah, I would be thankful if Meisam reads a section of this translation in Persian.
خیلی عذر میخوام که میثم جان، خیلی عذر میخوام که الان مداخله میکنم. الان یادم اومد یکی از حضار خواهش کرده بودن که میثم عزیز لطفاً میکروفون رو نچسبونید به لبتون. البته میدونم شما به نیت اینکه صدا بهتر بشه این کارو میکنید، ولی ظاهراً یه اختلالاتی ایجاد میکنه. مرسی.
الان صدای من خوبه؟
خیلی خوبه. برای من که خوبه. حالا خودخواه نباشم، نمیدونم شما خوب میشنوید صدا رو پگاه جان، مهدی عزیز؟
Yes.
بسیار عالی، بسیار.
خب من یه 2 تیکه میخوام انتخاب کردم، بذارید ببینم کدومش رو بخونم. بذارید از ابتدای قضیه بخونم، از شب قبل از اینکه شب‌ها شروع بشه، چون یک مقدار این سبک که پگاه اشاره کرد که سبکیه که فنیه شاید اینجا دیده بشه. بر این حالت غم‌اندوز بود که میاد صدا پگاه؟
بله.
بر این حالات غم‌اندوز بود که ناگاه در حرمسرای برادرش گشوده، ملکه زن برادرش با 20 کنیز مانند ماه‌های درخشان برون آمد. ملکه و کنیزان در آن بوستان مانند آهوان تشنه و عطشان می‌خرامیدند. شاه زمان آنگاه بر آنان نگاه نموده خود را از ایشان پنهان نمود. ملکه و کنیزان گامزنان و خرامان بودند تا رسیدند به زیر قصری که شاه زمان در شباک آن قصر نشسته بود. در آنجا حوضی بود پر از آب. کنیزان چون نزدیک حوض رسیدند برهنه شده از آنها 10 تا مرد و 10 دیگر زن گردیدند. بعد از عریانی هر یک با یار جانی چنان که دانی به عمل آوردند. اما ملکه زوجه برادرش به آواز بلند گفت ای سید من سعید، نزد من بیا. در آن وقت بنده سیاه بدزبان تنگ پوست و آکنده گوش و قبیح المنظر از بالای درختی هویدا گشته به زیر آمده و ملکه را در بر گرفت و از دستیش به دستیش می انداخت و 2 ساق سیمین او را حمایل و زنار می ساخت تا نصف روز بدین منوال بوده درد شهوت خواهش را به دوای وصل و اتصال شفا بخشیدند. بعد از آن غلامان از کنیزان جدا شدند. بنده سیاه از بالای سینه ملکه برخاست، پس جامه‌های خود را پوشیده همگی به صورت کنیزان گردیدند چنان که پیش از این بودند. سعید سیاه مقضی المرام شده از آن راهی که آمده بود باز به آن راه معاودت رفت. اما ملکه و کنیزان داخل حرمسرا شده در حرمسرا را مانند پیش بستند. چون شاه زمان کار خاتون حرم برادرش را دید، غموم و افکارش زوال پذیر گشته از محنت و علمی که از جانب زن نابکارش به وی رسیده بود رهایی یافت. آنگاه با خود گفت برادر من از من بزرگتر و ملک او از ملک من بیشتر است. با این همه مرتبه و شأن در قصر نشیمنش چنین فعل ناشایسته و کردار ناپسندیده است. زوجش عاشق چنین بنده سیاه و ناکس و فرومایه شده است. بالله مصیبت من از مصیبت او کمتر است. اکنون نزد من ظاهر شد که اکثر زنان خیانتکار ازدواج خود هستند. لعنت خدا بر ایشان باد و بر هر کسی که مایل و راغب به آنها و بر شخصی که زمام اختیار خود را به دست ایشان بسپارد. از این گونه سخنان خود به خود می گفت تا آنکه از بار بیماری سبک شده حزن و علمش سپری گشت. آنچه بر وی از وسوسه و اندیشه بد و خیالات پریشان غلبه و نیرو داشت رو به زوال نهاد. بعد از آن گفت چنان نمیپندارم که در جهان کسی از مکر و فریب زنان سالم باشد. خوشنود و فرحان بود تا شب شده برای او غذای شباهنگام آوردند. از آن طعام با اشتهای تام تناول نموده بر وی بسیار گوارا گردید، چنان که پیش از این چیزی نمیخورد و خوردنی گواراش نبود و در بستر آرام آسایش نمیغنود، چون با اشتهای زیاد و خواهش افزون طعام را تناول کرد، حمد و ثنای خالق بیچون به جا آورد. آن شب را به بهترین احوال به پایان رسانیده، بامداد روز دوم بهر او ناشتایی حاضر ساختند. از آن نیز نوش نمود، ستایش باری تعالی را معمول داشت. بدین منوال مدت 10 روز گذرانیده صحت مزاج و تندرستی یافت و پیوندهای بدنش محکم و استوار گردید.
میثم
چون
جان،
برادر خجستش
yeah, I just considering the time, I love hearing you actually. But as you can see, just this sample of the text Meisam read, only I'm pretty sure those who have read Tasuji's text already see the difference between the two in terms of, you know, the language that they use and how the kind of dramatization of the story itself. This is part of the frame story of the 1001 Night, the story between the two brothers, Shah Zaman and Shahriyar, and this, the way we see that in Bazanjiri's translation, we see a lot more dramatization, much more in terms of details of the story. And this happens not only with this frame story, but in many others. There are parts that when there are same stories in both Tasuji and Bazanjiri, we see that sometimes in the version in Tasuji is as long as just 1 or 2 paragraphs, or 2 or 3 paragraphs, while we find it in several folios being expanded in Bazanjiri's translation. So yeah, and also in terms of using the Indian style, what I mentioned, there are parts that he uses saj, but in using the saj, it doesn't. He does not Arabize he does not use so many Arabic terms, I would say, compared to, you know, the what we call Nasran Mutakallif, or, you know, that style in Persian literature, but it's more aligned with Indian style, I would say. And especially the beginning, the translator note is beautifully written, highly decorated, but we're also trying to kind of metaphorically engage with the title of the text in terms of, and you see the term, all this, you know, the metaphors around intercourse and intercoursing with language, as in the translator's note. And yeah, this is how I've seen it. We both actually were fascinated as we were transcribing the text by the language skills of Mohammad Baqir Khurasani, and in some of the stories, it's just, you know, amazing the way he narrates the story and the way he has translated it. He also, in his translator note, has something in terms of his theory of translation, where he discusses the fact that why that in his translation, because he also says that the 2-volume Arabic manuscript that I've had was not without its scribal errors. So in translating, I tried somehow to avoid those errors in my translation, to come up with a good choice or an informed guess in my translations. And also he notes that I also have added saj in my Persian translation as one of his, you know, method in a sense, the method that he has employed. Yeah.
Rhyming prose, rhyme. Okay, thank you very much. As you just mentioned Tasuji's version, I would like to know if you have found a chance to compare at least some of the stories between the two versions and see how they begin, how they end, regardless of the language. Have you come across any narrative which has been narrated differently in a version compared to the other? Have you found any changes, any interference that the translator might have somehow allowed himself to insert into his or his text, to somehow personalize a text, or maybe change the plot, maybe self-censor himself? Have you come across any cases?
Meisam Jan, do you want to answer to this question? If I may translate it to you. دکتر شهباز میپرسن در ترجمه بین دو ترجمه تسوجی و ترجمه بزنجردی تفاوتی رو از منظر نوعی که یک داستان رو هر دو ترجمه کردن میبینین که به یه معنا اینجوری برداشت بشه مترجم در این پروسه تونسته ترجمه رو شخصی سازی کنه هر کدوم از این دو مترجم و یه تفاوت مشخصی فارغ از تفاوت زبانی به سبکی که ما دربارش صحبت کردیم تو الان موردی رو دارید اینجا بحث کنیم.
ببینید از نظر من از نظر زبانی که خب اینا خیلی فاصله دارن هم دیگه، حالا اشاره هم کردیم از نظر شعری هم فاصله دارن، اما از نظر تفاوت داستان‌ها بجز داستان‌هایی که آروم آروم اضافه میشن و منم اشاره کردم داستان‌های کوتاهی هستن، نه ما تفاوت زیادی نمیبینیم، بجز این که مثلا داستان ملک بدر و از اونا توی تسویجی اونقدرها بهش پرداخته نشده، اینجا مفصلتر پرداخته میشه و داستان‌های اولی، اون چند داستانی که من اول نام بردم به خاطر اینکه خیلی لایه به لایه هستن، تو هر دو داستان ما این لایه به لایه رو میبینیم، فقط شکل هم توصیفات فرق میکنه. مثلا توی داستان علی ابن بکار و شمس النهار ما توی تسوجی ما یه عالمه شعرهایی میبینیم که جذابن، اینجا نه، ما اینجا یه عالمه وصف مثلا میزها، صندلیها، نوع حرکات رو میبینیم، یا خیلی داستان سعی میکنه که حالات درونی رو نشون بده، ولی ما توی مثلا داستان تسوجی این حالات درونی رو نمیبینیم، این اشاره به تمام اجزای اون ساختمون رو نمیبینیم. برخلافش ما ساختار داستان ها فقط یکی هن. یعنی توی ارائه داستان ها هم تغییر داره، توی شکل حضور اینها هم تغییر داره. میدونی توی مثلا توی این داستانی که همین علی ابن بکار دارم مثال میزنم، ورود جوهری با یه تفاوت‌هایی وارد میشه. میدونی اونجا یه داستانی داره، اینجا مثلا تا درد دل میاد ولی یه دفعه غیب میشه. بیشتر تفاوت‌ها تو شکل پرداخته، وگرنه ساختار کلی داستان‌ها عین به عینه، مگه داستانی که حذف شده.
Mehdi Jan, I'm sorry, Pegah, would you like to translate that? Maybe just a brief version, of what Meisam mentioned, so those who might not know Persian can also.
Yes, Meisam discussed the fact that, one of the differences as he, in his presentation, he pointed to what is in terms of what the additional stories that there are in Tasuji's version, but that we have discussed it in, as Egyptian family of manuscripts and Syrian family of Alf Layla Wa-Layla manuscripts. But when it comes to the plot of the stories, usually the stories which are in both versions, the plot is the same, but there are differences in terms of details and whether a story has been expanded in the Bazanjiri's version. There are several stories that has been expanded in Bazanjiri's version compared to Tasuji's, or he pointed to the fact that, for instance, in the story Ali ibn Baqir, when we look at the Tasuji's version, there is more poems in between the prose, while in Bazanjiri's, instead of those, we see a lot of details around, all that's that they have gathered for that party, or that basm, what was included, and all those details of which might be a clue to the even inner feelings of the characters. So this was part of what Meisam discussed. Am I missing any other section? Dr. Shahbaz?
I would like to add two important points. First of all, we had in the 19th century, we had this tradition of rendering texts from Persian into European languages and also into Indian vernaculars. But bringing an Arabic text to India and then commissioning it to someone to render it into Persian is kind of unique and worthy of attention. And the other point is, as you said, in Tarjumah Hinriyah, sometimes the translator shortens the frame narrative. In some parts, the frame narrative is already eliminated. These are signs of the, let's say, orality, signs of orality, oral storytelling, and shows that the stories were very popular and narrated, in the among the Arabs in the Arab-speaking world, and so they were, the scribe somehow recorded them as they were narrated. But once they are rendered into Persian, the language that the Persian translator chooses or uses becomes literary. So the text is somehow elevated to the level of, let's say, elite literature compared to the Arabic text. Of course, we have not seen the Arabic text yet. You have not identified the Arabic text yet, but we see such, cases with Khalila wa Dimna as well. For example, several versions of Khalila wa Dimna were available at the time, and they had signs of orality. The frame narrative was also almost not there, or halfway they preserved. It just pops out at the beginning of some chapters and disappears in the beginning or end of other chapters. And so I think this story in the Arabic version could have been written in let's say, more accessible Arabic, and the translator added more literacy to it.
Yeah, that's, I agree very much. It's one of the differences between the colloquial, even in the Arabic versions, the colloquial manuscripts compared to the editions, both whether Bolagh or the Kalkatev editions, both of which have kind of altered the text to a more literary level from this, what you mentioned, the oral version or more accessible version. And another point, as we were talking in terms of another difference between the two translators, is that the translator note is in terms of the translator note itself. While Tasuji does not discuss neither does he discuss his source. His translator note is only as long as 2 or 3 paragraphs. So he does not assert himself or does not reveal much about his source, his life, how long does it take for him to translate this text, or anything like that. But in Mohammad Baqir Khurasani's translation, we see at least a few folios describing his life, where he was born, how is it that he's now in Deccan, and he talks about both the patrons, the original manuscripts that he had, and shortly, at least 2 or 3 sentences about his translation method, as I discuss, and then finishes with a kind of dedicatory asida to celebrate the return or coming back of Henry Russell to Hyderabad. All this has helped us a lot to know more about him and the story behind this certain manuscript.
One last question I have. Any of you is ready to answer, despite the fact that this is named Alf Layla Wa-Layla and is to be seen as a rendering of this particular text. We know that in a large corpus of Persian literature, narrative literature in prose, some of the tales of Alf Layla Wa-Layla were already selected and rendered, included among majmu'as into collections of tales and stories. Have you had the chance to look into them? For example, Dalil Muhtale. I wonder if this is included in Tarjumah Hinriyah or not. Anyway, have you come across any of these tales? Have you found a chance to trace some of the tales of Alf Layla Wa-Layla in other collections of stories which dated much earlier than the 18th century?
If I may answer, and then I will ask Meisam if he has anything to add. First of all, as I said, I compared all the stories in this version with the Syrian manuscripts, and all those stories are also included with the same order in the 4 Syrian manuscripts, especially the Golan manuscript. As you know, Dr. Shahbaz, there's difference between Golan manuscripts and what he translated into French. So his manuscript is the oldest manuscript we have at hand, probably around 14th or 15th century, and it has only as many as 280 nights or something around that. But in his translation, what he has done, he has later added. So whatever other manuscripts he has received, he has started to translate those stories, adding to the next volumes of his translation. So there is a huge difference. When we think about his manuscript, it's probably the best or the most extensive in terms of the content Syrian manuscript we have at hand. But in his translation is probably also a kind of rise of this interest into just adding different manuscripts to the stories, or adding to the stories. So, but going back to answering your question, in the Tasuji's version, as Meisam Jan mentioned, there are stories which we can trace back actually to Mas'udi, or we can, or there are even duplicates. So in a sense, he has translated something and then he has translated it again. So it shows probably it's part of the manuscript that he had at hand. But here, there is nothing I can say about whether any of these stories have roots in others. Maybe if Meisam can add to this question. میسم جان، سوال اینه که آیا توی داستانه نسخه بزنجردی، نه نسخه تسوجی که من نکاتی گفتی اشاره کردم، داستانهایی رو دیدی که ریشه هاش رو به داستان دیگری تو متون قبلی یه فارسی یا قبلی دیگری بتونی برگردونی؟ یعنی فکر کنم مثلا داستان علی ابن بکار یا هر داستان دیگه‌ای که اینجا ما داریم تو بزنجردی قبلا تو نسخه دیگه‌ای بوده، اینو بتونید در یه ارتباط احتمالاً بین متنی با اونها بیارید.
خیلی سوال سختیه، اونم برای این ساعت صبح تهران، ولی بجز داستانی که خود آقای بیضایی هم اشاره کرده که ما داستان اصلی رو میتونیم تو همای و بهمن و این آدما ببینیم، داستان دیگه ای نداره که ما بتونیم مثلا به طور 100% بگیم که از یک نسخه ساسانی یا پهلوی گرفته باشه. مثلا یه سری چون من همزمان با این شروع کردم، یه سری از متون مثل سمک عیار، مثل داستان همچین چینی که یه ذره نثرم باشن رو با همدیگه مقایسه کردن و بیشک من هیچ همچین چیزی رو حس نکردم توی، یعنی که مثلا با توجه به گذشته‌ای هم که خودم داشتم تو داستان‌های فارسی، من چیزی رو احساس نکردم که مثلا بتونیم بهش گیر بدیم که بگیم این رو میتونیم توی یکی از داستان‌های فارسی پیدا بکنیم. 100% مثلا داستان گلنار دریایی که اگه اشتباه نکنم نبایدم توی تسویجی باشه، خیلی شباهت داره به داستان‌های مثلا رومی، احتمالاً از اون طرف اومده. من نتونستم به جز ساختار اصلی داستان که هسته اصلی داستانه که همون شهرزاد اینا هستن، داستانی رو پیدا کنم که بیشک ایرانی باشه، به جز همون علی ابن بکار که مثلا یاد میشه که این شهرزاده ایرانیه، یا اصلا ساختار داستان اون دو دختر و پسر شهرزاده‌ای که اجنه اینها رو به هم میرسونن. داستان به شدت یعنی یونانی طوره، یعنی که قشنگ داستان داره شکل میگیره، داستان پخش میشه. چون من جدیداً دوباره شروع کردم یه سری از متون پهلوی رو خوندن، مثلا همین خداینامه که نداریم، حالا چیزهای شبیه اون مثلا یادگار زهیران اینا، اصولا همچین چیزهایی رو من ندیدمش. یعنی که بازم نمیتونم مثلا تو این لحظه بگم که مثلا میتونیم پیدا کنیم یا نه، ولی به شدت کمه. میتونم توضیح دیگه هم بدم اگه چیزی دیگه هست.
خواهش میکنم اگر صلاح میدونید. آره فکر میکنم یه خورده هم we're a little bit over time a little bit more than a little bit. آره یه خورده از وقتمون هم گذشته. یه سوال هم داریم، یه سوال هم البته به ذهن من رسید.
Mustafa Can, we will only end this lecture when the dawn has arrived, you know. It's only with the dawn that we will...
Oh, the dawn. And yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much to all of you, and but especially due to time restraint and of course the time discrepancy, you have my special thanks, Meisam John and Mehdi John, because I know how late it is. It's more than late, it's just so what is the exact time there in Tehran, because I know both of you are located in Iran right now.
It's 5 past 5.
Past 5, and you have been with us, since around 2 hours ago. So thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Shahbaz, for the thoughtful questions and the great discussion that all of you had and you basically aroused. So very quickly, if you don't mind, and then after this, I'll again pass it on to you if there's any final remarks before we thank the audience and say goodbye. So first of all, my warm congratulations, Mehdi and Meisam Aziz, for the imminent publication of the book. I think we had arranged. Our initial intention was that we would hold the event at a time when we would have your book in hand, so we could also show it, right? Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but I know that it's very close to the publication date. And I assume Dr. Ganjavi, that you will have an introduction in the book where you will place your textual criticism in the broader conversations around your topic and around the scholarship on the topic, right? So I very much look forward to, as I'm sure many others are, including Dr. Shahbaz, to read your book. We had a question. By the way, we have the pleasure of having, I mean, a lot of good names are here, but I cannot help mentioning that we are also joined by the Professor Ulrich Marzolf. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Marzolf. For those who might not, I'm not sure if there's anyone who doesn't know Dr. Marzolf, but he's definitely among the most prolific authors on Alf Layla Wa-Layla. There is an anonymous attendee question who asks, did you find the original Arabic manuscript of this Persian translation? And I assume that this was answered by Pegah, but if you want to, I mean, by implication when she was referring to the fact that you haven't, right? But in one of the slides, you had a page in Arabic and then a page in Persian. Was that just for decoration purposes or no? Or was it a manuscript, a different manuscript, right?
Yeah, in one of the slides, I had put a page from Golan manuscripts, if you're referring to that page. But yeah, but also I should note that why we don't have we haven't yet found the original manuscript, Arabic manuscript, but the Winfeld manuscript, the first I think 40 folios, have collected all the Arabic sections in this translation and transcribed them in the first, scribed them in the first 40 folios. But these are mainly poems, and all the Arabic verses within the text now has also been copied another time in the beginning of this manuscript. So we do not see the prose section, but only the verse accompanied with the in the margins, we can also see Persian translation of those in the first 40 folios, but that's different from, having access to the original Arabic version.
Beautiful. So Mehdi Jan, this is not my particular area, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But when you mentioned about authenticity, right? Because in part of your presentation, you talk about how your textual study of Henriyah translation reveals that it's been translated from a Syrian manuscript, and then you go on to say that it's more, it seems to be older, homogeneous, and arguably more authentic, right? So how would we define, and given the fact that we don't even know, based on which particular text or maybe texts or manuscripts, right, it was translated, how would you define authenticity for a text, a collection of texts that doesn't even have, a single author, whose origin might be unknown, et cetera, right? With all those of uncertainties, like how can we define, like what do you exactly mean by authenticity here?
Yeah, here I'm relying on, first of all, on Mohsen Mahdi's discussion of the families of Alf Layla Wa-Layla in terms of, there are stories which have been part of the core stories of Alf Layla for a couple of centuries. And at least we know that of all the manuscripts dating earlier than 17th century, basically the Golan manuscript and the later three other Syrian manuscripts, and common core stories. And then when we look at the manuscripts that were produced, we see all these additions to the story. So I don't, by using the term authentic, I mainly want to also emphasize that, or nowadays the dominant version of the Alf Layla that we are facing, both in Iran in many of the translations and many of the printed versions, is the version which was which was produced in this process of manuscript market, and this process that copies during the late Ottoman era started to, come up with more and more stories, sometimes adding stories from just folk stories of the time. But when we look at the earlier versions, we see that this is different from the earlier version. The earlier versions rarely have any of those very much. The earlier versions were produced and developed during Mamluk era, not Ottoman era, and the core and stylistic core stories and stylistic themes are quite similar to each other. And for instance, even this happens also in terms of the poems. So all the poems because one of our access points to the original Arabic, beside the order of the stories, how stories are developing, the plot, etc., are those Arabic sections in the Persian translation. And I've went through all of them and compared them with the Arabic verses in the Syrian manuscripts. And this is another point that I see quite a similarity. None of the poems here we can find here that are not in them, and almost most of them are shared between this Persian translation and the Syrian manuscript versions. This is also and are very close in the way they have been scribed by within our text. So I also try to use that as an access point to the original Arabic.
I see. Thank you very much. I couldn't help smiling when Meisam was almost sleeping, because again, it's so late over there. But thank you so much, Dr. Ganjavi. I assume that you will. So again, we should wait for the introduction in a sense to get all the details of behind all these claims and justifications and arguments, of course. And thank you so much. So again, if there's any final remarks, please go ahead. اگر صحبت پایانی هست میثم جان، دکتر شهباز، دکتر گنجوی and Mr. Alipour.
I just say thank you very much. Go ahead.
خیلی ممنون. Thank you very much for joining us during this last event of this year. So if you don't mind, I just want to very quickly also again thank our audiences. Some of whom have persisted this far, and they have stayed with us. Thank you so much for being with us. As you can see, there's a survey. I wouldn't expect you to fill it out at this point because it's a little bit too late, but if you are kind enough to do that, that would be very helpful to us. As you can see, our presenters have also generously shared their emails, and so they're happy to receive any further questions you might have or any comments. Thank you very much. And also, just to let you know that we have another lineup of very interesting topics for next year, beginning from January 15th with a talk by Dr. Janet Afri, titled Mullah Nasruddin of Tiflis and the Transnational Diasporic Milieu that gave birth to it during 1906 to 1931. Dr. Afri will be joined by Dr. Hassan Javadi, Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley, as a discussant. So we would like to invite you to join us during that event and the subsequent events as well. And so at this point, I would like to just say that if you're celebrating it, Merry Christmas in advance, and if not, Happy Holidays. And thank you very much again to all of our presenters. You all have a good rest of the day or night wherever you're located. Thanks and bye.